Okay, so as I said, thanks so much for joining. My name is Natalie and I'm the Schools Liaison Officer at Magdalene College. So that means I work with lots of schools around the country and work with students to encourage them to apply to Cambridge and also other top universities. And I'm also organising this essay competition, which is brand new for this year and really, really exciting. So thank you so much for being part of it and I hope you find it worthwhile. I'm going to talk today about the first stage of entering a competition like this, which is planning and researching for your essay. Just to give you a heads up, I am going to talk quite generally about the process of writing, planning and researching an essay. I'm not going to go into too much depth on the specific questions because, as I'll talk about a bit later on, they are meant to be really creative and allow you to take your own spin on it and do your own thing. And so I'm not going to kind of give you any answers to the questions, not that there are any. The idea is for you to take your own approach, decide what you want to do and how you want to approach the questions. So hopefully this will give you some quite good transferable skills. So as well as entering this competition, things like this will be useful for any coursework you have to do as part of your A-levels, if you're doing an extended project qualification or an EPQ or anything similar like that, the Welsh Baccalaureate as well. So these sorts of skills are really useful for no matter what you're doing, but hopefully they'll come in useful for the competition as well. So this session is going to cover these 4 things. I've allowed an hour for the session. It might not take that long, but we have plenty of time for your questions as well. The first thing I'm going to go through is breaking down the task of writing an academic essay. So firstly, what makes it a bit different from the essays you might be used to writing in school. And then secondly, how you can get started with essay planning and research, including some recommendations for research methods and sources, so where you can go to find that information as well. And then finally, I'm going to talk briefly about how you can develop a creative approach to answering the questions. So I mentioned that these essay questions are designed for you to put your own spin on them, to decide how you'd like to approach them. And so we'll talk about how you can do that and how you can make your essay as interesting as possible for the people who are going to be reading it. So you're likely to be familiar with writing exam-style essays. So these are a little bit different to what are academic essays, which we're going to talk about today. So a few examples of what makes exam-style essays and academic essays a bit different, just to give you an idea of what you're working with and where we're trying to end up by the end of this competition. So an exam-style essay that you're probably quite used to writing from your GCSEs or perhaps any A-level mock exams you've done so far. You have quite a rigid time limit, and in that time you have to quickly argue the main points in answer to the question. So you're probably very used to kind of scribbling down your answers as fast as you can and working to that very tight time limit. We don't really have that with academic essays. This competition is open until the end of April, the 28th of April, so you have so much time to do your research, do your planning and write your essay. So you don't really have that time limit. It does give you a lot more time for some really thorough research and planning. So unlike an exam style essay where you have to recall your evidence from memory and you have to make your arguments kind of from things that you already know, from information you've plucked out of your brain, for an academic essay, you can use lots of different sources to provide relevant evidence to back up your points. And this means they can be very accurate, very detailed, and you're not relying on your memory as much as you would do in an exam. Again, with the limits that you might have in an exam style essay, you often have a word count or a page limit, or simply how much you can write in 45 minutes or in an hour. For an academic essay, it's often a bit longer. So for this competition, we're asking you to write about 2,000 words. This is the length of an essay that you would do at university. So our Cambridge students at the moment, if you're studying something like history or English, you'll be asked to write an essay probably every week and it'll be about 2,000 words long. So that's why we've chosen this limit to kind of emulate what a university style essay would look like. And in that essay, you have a lot more space than you would do in an exam to develop arguments and counter arguments and be quite detailed in that. Whereas in an exam, you'd have to be quite brief and get across your main points quite quickly. In an academic essay, you have a lot of space to develop more complex arguments, talk about some of the nuances in your points, and include multiple sources of evidence to back up your arguments as well. And finally, in an academic essay, you are expected to reference your sources. And I'm going to come on to this more in the third webinar in this series, which is about referencing and refining your essay. But it's good to be aware of that you need to keep a note of all the sources you're using when you're writing your academic essay, so you can reference them at the end. This is something quite new. You might not come across this before, and you probably won't have done it in an exam before. But you'll also have to do a bibliography, which is a kind of long list of all the sources that you've used, just so that the readers know where you've got your information from and that you're not kind of accidentally plagiarizing other people's work when you're writing your essay. But there is one really key similarity when you're writing an academic essay and an exam style essay. I've talked about that you can be more detailed in an academic essay and you have more space to argue your points and include evidence, but you have to stay on track. You have to answer the question. We don't want you to kind of go off on a tangent and find something else that you're finding quite interesting and don't end up answering the question. 2,000 words seems like quite a lot, but you will very quickly run out of space if you're going off on these tangents and writing about what else you find interesting in relation to the topic. So it's important to stay focused on the question being asked and make sure that every paragraph you're writing, every sentence you're writing, it puts the point across and it helps you to answer the question overall. So the idea of writing an academic essay can seem really daunting. It might be quite a lot longer than things you've faced before. It might be quite an unfamiliar task, but with any major piece of work you're faced with, it's a really good idea to break it down into more manageable steps. It makes the task seem a bit less daunting and a bit more manageable. So I've chosen these 7 steps essentially to writing an academic essay, and I'm going to go through the first 5 of them today. If you would like to watch the second webinar in this series, this will cover step 6, and step 7 will be the third webinar in the series, as I mentioned before. But you'll notice that steps 1 to 5 are all before you even start writing the essay. So unlike in an exam where you might do a quick kind of 2-minute plan before you launch into your writing, with this, it's important to take your time with it. Take your time doing your research, making your plan, because you do have that time available, and it'll make the writing process so much easier and more manageable if you have a really solid plan in place. So I'm going to go through each of these steps one by one and talk about how you can do each one to make your task a bit easier and breaking it down to make it more manageable. There's going to be quite a lot of information on these slides, so feel free to kind of grab a pen and paper to note things down if you want. And do remember that you can go back to this webinar and go back to the slides later on using the recording if you want to. So firstly, choosing a question. So there are lots and lots of questions available in this competition, and there might be a few that you're deciding between. If you're not sure which question you want to answer yet, then there's some advice here. Firstly, pick a question that intellectually stimulates you. So something you find exciting that you think that you might like to answer because it interests you, it meets your subjects. It might refer to one of the subjects that you're studying at A-level, or just something that you're interested in and might want to study at university. It could be something that you don't study yet, but you might want to in the future, and that's absolutely fine. Remember that you'll have to put forward a variety of arguments in response to the question. So if you're looking at one of the questions and thinking that you absolutely agree with it and you don't know how else people could think differently, then maybe instead choose one that you think there could be multiple points of view. And so you could create a really interesting essay that's going to consider all those different points of view and put your argument across and your opinions, but also consider other perspectives and how someone else could argue it differently. So you might already have a question in mind, and that's great. But if you don't, have a look at the list and also have a look at the subjects below each question. So each question says, if you like this question, have a look at these different subjects that are offered at the University of Cambridge. And so you can use those to help you figure out what sorts of things the question might be referring to, what sort of knowledge the question might want you to draw on, if you have it, to answer the question. But also remember that you can answer the question however you want. You can answer it based on your subject background, what you know, what you find interesting, and that will make a really creative response. So be really careful with choosing your question and making sure it's something that really interests you and that you can put forward a good argument for. The next step is a very kind of brief research phase. So it's something that you might want to do before you start going into your more in-depth research, but just have a quick search around and figure out what is out there, what you can use when you're answering the question. So what I like to do is start with a really quick Google search, just having a look at any of the key terms used in the question, making sure I'm really confident in the definitions of those terms, and also having a look if it's a quote that's used in the question, as some of those questions are, having a look at who said that quote, where it comes from, what year it was said, whether it's from a speech or a book or a diary, whatever it comes from, and finding some context on that. That might help you see it in a different light, and help you learn more about that person and their background and their story. I would also have a really brief look at some of the literature relating to the topic. So if you do a quick Google for the topic and immediately a few authors come up because they are really, really key authors on that topic, then have a look at them. Some examples might be if there was a question on evolution, which of course there isn't, but then you would obviously want to read something by Charles Darwin because he is a very big figure in that field. So things like that, anyone you can find that has clearly written a really important text on that field, and making sure that you're aware of them. This might also give you a sense of some of the different arguments people might make in response to the question. So if you're not quite sure where your opinion lies at the moment, then have a look at some of these literature, some of these texts, and that might help you figure out firstly what you think, but also what someone else might think as well. This is an initial research phase, so it doesn't have to be very extensive at all. You don't have to make loads and loads of notes at this point. It's just getting a sense of whether the question is the right one, and if you're struggling to find this information, maybe choose a different one, and also making sure that you can make an initial plan for the further research you want to do and go into more depth. So the next stage will be to create this plan. You don't have to have a very full plan at this stage, but having a small plan in place can help you plan how you're going to approach your research, which is one of the next stages. So you might want to start with your overall argument. If you were faced with that question in an exam, what would your argument be? What would you say? And this might change over the course of your research. And again, that's absolutely fine. You don't have to stick with the same argument throughout. You might be influenced by some things that you read, and that's absolutely fine. But if you do have a really strong opinion on the topic, then setting out your overall argument will help shape how your essay comes out. Also thinking about what counter arguments can be made. So we've talked about different perspectives you might want to consider. Other arguments you might want to add into your essay before you kind of disprove them with your evidence and make your argument the kind of overall focus of the essay. From your initial research, you might have identified a few key pieces of evidence you want to include, so you can think about how you might want to slot them into your essay. And this also applies to any of that key literature you've talked about and you've found in your initial research. So anything that you think is really important to the topic and you want to make sure that you fit in there somewhere, that's absolutely a really good thing to do when you're creating your initial plans, so you don't forget about it later on. As I've said, your plan might change as you delve further into your research, and that's a really good thing. That shows that you're kind of engaging with the text that you're reading, you're finding new pieces of evidence to back up your arguments, so it's fine if your plan changes as you go along. Then one of the bigger stages is your detailed research. So this should take quite a while, and you can carry on researching throughout the process. You might find that you do some more research after you start writing. And again, that's okay. But your research phase should cover all the evidence that you need to write a really good essay. So you want to keep researching until you feel like you've got enough to write your essay from. So you could think about breaking it down a bit further into some of these key steps. So firstly, look at these literature that you found. So any key authors, any key texts that you identified that are really important to the topic. You want to read through some of these key pieces of literature and take notes on them, find evidence to either support your opinion, but other people's opinions. Take notes of anything you find useful, but remember to reference it. So if you're paraphrasing or using quotation marks, making sure you're noting down where you got it from and whether it's your words or someone else's, so that you know that you're not accidentally plagiarizing someone's work. You should note down the title and the author of the text to make sure you can go back to it if you need to. This includes any web links that you've got, if it's a website or an article that's online, and any page numbers if it's a book. These are partly so you can return to it later on. Chances are you might want to go back to something to make sure you've noted it down correctly, or to find any more information that that book had in it. But also to make sure that you can reference it correctly when it comes to your bibliography and your referencing a bit later down the line. So as I've said, this should take quite a while. Do all the research that you think you need to create your essay. Taking notes, you can do it a lot of different ways, and I'll talk about a few different ones, but making sure you've got enough evidence to support each of the points you laid out in your plan. And anything else that you find interesting, you might find that in your research stage, you find new arguments and new points that you hadn't initially included in your plan, and that's fine. You can add them in. It's a really good way to show that you're engaging with the subject if you're adapting your plan as you go along with your research. So when you've done enough research, or you think you've done enough research, you can go back to your original plan. Is there anything else you want to add in? Has your opinion changed? Have you found one of the arguments or one of the points really persuasive? And if so, you might need to slightly adapt your plan to make sure that that opinion, your new opinion, is at the forefront of your essay. And are there any gaps in your research? Are you confident that you have the materials to start writing? So if you've made a plan and one of your points has kind of no evidence next to it, and that's a sign that either it's not an important point, or that you need to do some more research to find some evidence to back it up. So going back to your plan at different stages of this process is a really good way to make sure that you're consistently working to a plan, you're having a structure to your essay, but also adapting it as you do your research. So I think one of the questions that I've been asked a lot is, where do I find all this information? And it's a really good question. You might be used to in school, your teachers providing you with sources of information, they're telling you which textbooks to read, which pages, and going out and doing your own research is a little bit different. So I've got a few recommendations here on the screen, but there are so many more that you could have a look at. So firstly, your local library is always a good start. They will probably have more books than you think they do, especially in the kind of non-fiction sections you might not have explored before. So asking librarians or having a look on the shelves and see if there's anything that relates to that topic. If you don't have access to a library or your library isn't as useful, then there are plenty of online sources. So a few online ones, one is called JSTOR. So if you search that up, it will come up, and they have loads of free articles that are written by academics. They're from academic journals on lots of different topics. And lots of them are freely available. You don't have to log in or anything. So have a look for any of those that you can access. You might find that really useful, and they're often very balanced and opinionated. So they'll have they're set out like you should write your essay. So they have an opinion, they have an argument, but they're also very balanced in that they'll talk about different points and different points of view. So you can talk about those in your essay, and you can also use them as an advice on how to structure. So that might be useful for a variety of reasons. The same goes for Google Scholar, which is very similar. You might find articles or books on there that you haven't previously explored, and they might be freely available books that are really important to your topic. If you're looking at one of the questions to do with something like classics or archaeology, visiting museums, if you have access to them, is a really good way to get some evidence to support your answers. Your evidence doesn't have to just be what we call secondary evidence, so evidence that comes from literature in terms of what other academics have written about. You can also get some really good primary evidence by looking at artifacts in museums, or if you're doing one of the English questions, then literature in terms of novels, plays, poetry. You can get really good primary evidence from those examples. You don't have to just focus on what other academics have written about. There are loads of podcasts freely available on Spotify or Apple Music if you have access to those. Really good ways to kind of engage with different topics, especially if you're not a huge reader, if you've done quite a lot of reading and you want to try something different, a different way to learn. Just again, remember to reference where you got it from, where you got the information from, so you've got that noted down for when you come back to do your bibliography. You might find news articles that relate to your topics. So quite often when academics make new discoveries about a topic, it does feature in the news. So you might find articles on websites or news websites or newspapers that relate to your topic and you find quite useful. Equally, there might be some things in your textbooks for your subjects at school, things that you might not have made connections between to the topic, but have a quick look at those and see if anything is relevant. And finally, ask your teachers. Quite often teachers will have more resources available or they'll know where to find good information. So you could tell them that you're entering this competition and ask for some recommendations of where to look for resources on that subject. And I'm sure they'll be able to help you. They sometimes also have subscriptions to history magazines, sociology magazines, those sorts of things, that they might be willing to share with you or download articles for you if you know what you want. So all these sources of information are really, really useful, and hopefully you'll find what you need there. If you are struggling for sources of information, then you keep Googling the terms of the question or an author, and you'll hopefully go on a kind of into a rabbit hole of information and things that you find interesting and relevant to the question. I've got a few notes on reading strategies that might be helpful when you're doing your research. It's really easy for me to sit here and say, do some research, but what does that actually mean? What does it look like and how can you do it effectively? So there might be so much information when you Google these questions and when you start looking for information. So how do you kind of grapple with it? How do you find out what you really want to know? So in being selective, you can use things like contents pages if you're looking at physical books to identify the really useful and key chapters. You don't have to read the entirety of a book. You can read the introduction and conclusion if that's all you need. You can read one chapter from it if you can identify which is going to be the useful one. You can also use the index in books to find out keywords and which pages these focus on. Make sure you're staying focused when you're doing your reading. So making sure you're looking for an answer to the question or evidence to back up a specific point you're trying to make. Try and think to yourself, what are you trying to find out from your reading? What are you trying to get out of that information? Another thing you could do is looking at the footnotes in books or in articles that tells you where the author got their information from. And that can be a really good way to find something else to read afterwards if you're interested in the topic or think it's useful to answering your question. And finally, remember to consider whether the source is reliable and up to date. So a lot of sources are very old-fashioned, very out of date now. When you look at news articles on the internet, for instance, they will feature ones that were from years ago, perhaps. So just taking a note of what year the source was written or what year it was, if it was a speech, what year it was said, things like that, so that you know how reliable the source is and how useful it is for you. Also, when you come to taking your notes, this can be quite a different experience to what you're used to. How are you going to take notes from these texts and these sources best so you can come back to them, so you can refer back to them, and so they can be useful for the writing process in your essay. So thinking about how you work best, do you prefer to type or to handwrite your notes? Either is absolutely fine. Just remember that if you're typing, try and avoid the temptation to copy and paste. By writing your own notes, you are more engaged with the content. So as you're writing or typing, you're thinking about what the text is saying, what your notes are meaning, maybe how it connects to other things that you've read. And it also reduces the risk of plagiarism by accidentally kind of copy and pasting someone else's work into your essay, which is what we want to avoid. You might want to use kind of headings and bullet points. So when I was writing my essays at university, I would have a heading for each of my paragraphs that I wanted to write. And then when I found some information that related to one of those points, I would bullet point that under the heading. And so when I was scrolling back through my notes, I would always see whether I had enough bullet points below each heading to write a paragraph on that topic. This can also help keep your note-taking focused and stop you just taking notes on things that aren't really relevant to your question. But again, remember that you can amend your plan as you go along. So if you find a new point you want to add in, then do that. Add in new points and add evidence below them so that you've got an extra paragraph to add into your essay. If you're doing this method, you can also have kind of more points than you might need. You can include, so say if you're planning to add 8 paragraphs in your essay, you can do, let's say, 10 headings and then find out which are the ones that you have the most evidence for and the most evidence to back up your argument for. And those are likely to be the strongest points, the ones that you have the most evidence to back up. They're going to be your strongest arguments. These are just examples of how many paragraphs you need, by the way. We can talk a little bit more about structuring your essay in the next session, but essentially as many points as you think are useful to answering your question, and as many points as you think are necessary to cover all bases, but also answer the question with your opinion. You could also include summaries of your notes. So rather than doing the headings and bullet points method, you could do a heading for each of your sources, for instance, and include some key points, some quotes, some examples to summarize what you got from each source, and then go back and perhaps assign that source to a paragraph or to a point that you're trying to make. You also might want to color code your notes if you work well with color, and you can kind of use that to help you figure out where you want to place examples within your essay, in which paragraphs and which sections. You could highlight your notes according to which point they relate to, or alternatively, which author if you're using multiple texts by the same author. This can also help you identify any gaps in your research. If you notice that you've only got one thing highlighted in yellow, for instance, you need to find some more things to back up that point. And again, remember to keep a record of all your sources, including the titles, authors, web links, and page numbers, so you can go back to them a bit later on. So a really important point is you don't have to include everything. So I've talked about including perhaps more headings in your plan than you may have space for in your essay. And you will likely have to kind of narrow down your work and narrow down which sources you're going to include and which points you want to include as you go along with the research process. 2,000 words may seem a really, really long essay, but it does go quite quickly once you get into the topic and you start writing about what you're interested in. So if you're deciding between kind of which paragraphs to include or which sections to include from your plan, trying to focus on the most important points and those that you think you have the strongest evidence in support of. So for every point you're making, you want to make sure you have a couple of really, really good examples to prove that point or demonstrate what you're meaning by that. And to make sure those are really strong and persuasive. There is definitely not a set number of paragraphs in an academic essay. Just make sure that each paragraph has enough space for you to firstly state the point the paragraph is making. So this can be your first sentence of each paragraph, saying why you're including the paragraph, what are you trying to say, what's the point that you're making. The next thing you want to include is specific and relevant evidence, and this includes engaging with the secondary literature if it's appropriate. So these are the examples to back up what you're saying, to show what you mean from real life examples or literature examples, what's going to be in support of your point. And the next point is to analyze the evidence. What does it show and why is it useful? So you might notice that this is quite similar to the PEE paragraphs you might be used to at school. And you don't have to be as explicit in, this is my point, this is my evidence, this is my explanation. But it is a really useful structure to ensure you're hitting all of these checkpoints and making sure that your paragraph is firstly very clearly focused. So it has a really clear point to it. It has, secondly, really good evidence. And thirdly, that you've analysed it. You've explained what the evidence means and why it's useful. And then finally, make sure to link your paragraph back to the overall argument and in answer to the question. So how does it help to develop what you're trying to say? Each of your paragraphs should at some point lead back to either a support of your overall argument or a counter argument that you're later going to dismiss or disprove in improving your own argument and your opinion. So making sure you're keeping it relevant to the question, making sure that each of your paragraphs has a really key focus, and it's really clear why it's relevant to that question and why you've chosen to include it. So again, this is one example of how you might want to structure your paragraphs and structure your essay, but it is a good example, and it makes sure that you're hitting all these checkpoints and you're including what you need to include to be a successful paragraph. You can also think about your introduction and conclusion. So these might become a bit clearer when you're writing your essay, which is why some people choose to do the introduction and conclusion last. But sometimes it can be useful to do your introduction at the start so that you have a framework and a scope for your essay and you know what you're writing next. So perhaps you have an opening sentence in mind, something that you've read or you come up with that you think that would make a great opening sentence. Perhaps a really concise summary of your interpretation of the question is just one example. But don't spend too long on this. Some people spend ages and ages trying to find the perfect opening sentence, and it really isn't that important. If you're wasting all your time thinking of the first sentence, you're neglecting the rest of the essay. So if you're not sure, come back to it later. Or put a kind of placeholder sentence in that will do for now and you might change later on. You can do a lot of editing later down the line, but just getting something written is really helpful. Your introduction should also set out your argument. So the reader wants to know what they can expect from your essay. What are you going to say? What sorts of points are you going to consider, and what will be your overall conclusion? It's almost like giving them a spoiler. You're going to tell them what you're going to say by the end of the essay. They want to know in advance, they know what to expect. You also might want to explain the scope of your essay, so whether you've approached the question through a particular lens. So for instance, if you're approaching one of the questions that can be considered from different subject backgrounds, so for instance, philosophy or theology or law or politics, then explain which one you've chosen or whether you've chosen multiple, and explain that at the start of your essay so that, again, the reader knows what to expect from it and how they should be viewing your argument. You could also include a reference to some of the points or arguments that you have knowingly excluded. So you can talk about what you have said in your essay and also what you've missed out. Showing an awareness of the scope of your essay is really important. You can't cover an entire topic in 2,000 words. It is a really short amount of time to cover an entire topic, everything to do with that subject. And so there will be things that you've missed out. If there's something that you really didn't have space for, then you could mention it here in your introduction, just to show an awareness of what you have and haven't included. And then in your conclusion, it is a really good place to summarize the points you made throughout the essay. You don't want to kind of repeat yourself and say, you know, as I've said, you want to kind of reword it a little bit and bring together your arguments into kind of one or two sentences to explain how they all link together and why they were all relevant to answering the question. Really confidently reiterate your point of view. So the reader should always be really clear on what your argument is, what you're saying, and why they should agree with you. And then any final remarks. So whether the essay will be any different if you had approached the question from a different angle. So if you had approached it from a law perspective or a philosophy perspective, would your answer have been different? This isn't applicable to all the questions and certainly isn't necessary, but it's one thing that you could consider, again, in looking at the scope of your essay and what you included and didn't include. This includes identifying the limitations of your research and how this might have affected your argument. So this is something that comes into academic work at a quite high level. Academics will say, well, I had these sources available to me, so that's why I came to this argument. You could talk about how if you had used different sources, you might have had a different argument. And that's absolutely fine. That's really good to talk about where you got your information from, where your opinion might have been influenced from. And being aware of that shows a really good academic mindset. Again, the introduction and conclusion can come a bit later if you'd like to focus on writing your body paragraphs first. But it can be useful to have that framework in mind so you know what you're aiming for when you're writing the rest of your essay. And the final thing I want to talk about is this idea of developing a creative approach to answering the question. So all the essay questions that we've chosen for this year's competition are deliberately intended to facilitate a variety of approaches. So what we hope is that no two essays are the same. You have the freedom to choose how you approach the question, how you structure your essay, and what evidence you use to support your points. So the questions can be interpreted in a load of different ways, and we want to hear how you interpret them. Developing a creative approach to the question comes from all the things we've already discussed. So things like drawing evidence from a variety of sources. So being really thorough in your research, doing as much research as you can to have a look at loads of different texts or sources, or both primary and secondary sources, drawing that evidence from them and figuring out how you can construct that into an argument in answer to the question. The more sources you use, the more kind of widely read you are, the more you're going to be able to develop this creative argument drawing on all these different sources. We want you to explore a range of arguments and counter arguments. So being quite detailed in which points you're making, whether you agree with them, whether you disagree with them, and having that scope to do a lot of different things within your essay. You have 2,000 words, and it should be enough to cover a lot of different points of view. Considering how academics from different subject backgrounds might interpret the question differently. So if you're answering one of the questions that is perhaps applicable to lots of different subjects, you could have a look at different academics and what they've written about it, and just do a little bit of research onto what their subject background is. So if you're reading an article written by a historian or a political scientist or a philosopher, their subject background might give you some insight into why they've argued what they have done, and why their argument is focusing on a certain part of the question or using certain evidence to back up their points. It's kind of quite good to know if you're looking at loads of different sources from lots of different people. Having that context on the authors can be quite useful for giving some insight into why they've argued what they have. Finding unique and interesting examples to support your points. So any really good bits of evidence that you can find, any examples that are quite unique and quite different, those are really, really good. So for instance, if you're answering one of the questions about English or about poetry or languages, finding any really interesting examples you can find in any of those languages. There's so much out there, so any quite niche texts that people might not have read, anything you can find that's quite interesting and unique is going to give you a really creative argument because no one else is going to have used that evidence. And finally, being really creative in your language choices. The point about language is important because we want you to be clear overall. So we want to know what you're saying, what you mean. You don't have to use loads of fancy words to get your point across. If you want to show off your vocabulary, then that's really great. But just make sure that you're confident in what you're trying to say and what the words mean. But by being quite creative in the language you're using, you can explain how you're answering the question with a really creative argument. You might want to include things like, well, I agree with this person with the caveat, or with the, the point that something else. So you agree with them in part, but also have your own opinions, or you have a reservation about some elements of their argument. And you can be quite creative in how you use language to present those points and how to back up those points as well. So all these things you can do to develop a really creative approach to answering the questions, put your own spin on it, make it a bit different and make it stand out. So I'm going to stop there for today and I'm going to answer any questions that you have, and then we will come back to this slide. But essentially, I hope this session has covered the planning and writing process. So this should give you enough to get started on for now, enough research methods, enough recommendations to have a look at some sources and different ways to approach planning and structuring your essay. In the next session, which is in about 3 weeks' time, we're going to look at the actual writing process and how you get started, moving from that planning stage to the writing stage, developing an academic argument in response to the question, and also structuring that essay as well. So if you have any questions for me, please do pop them in the Q&A and I will happily answer them. And if you're welcome to drop off now if you haven't got any questions. There will be a quick survey that comes up when you leave the Zoom. I'd be really grateful if you fill out some feedback about the session. It's really helpful for us to know whether you enjoyed it, whether you found it useful, so we can make it better for next time. And hopefully I'll see you on the 15th of March for the next session. For those of you staying to ask your questions, I will go through them now. The first question I've got is, can you write answers for more than one question? No, we are limiting to one entry per person. So pick one of the questions and you can answer that one. Does the writing style have to be neutral and unbiased? And does it have to be balanced in terms of arguments to support and against? So it definitely doesn't have to be neutral. We want to hear what your argument is, what your opinion is. However, it is really important to show that you've considered other points of view. So a really good way to do this is to focus on your argument and include several paragraphs to support that and coming at it from just slightly different angles, but also show some counter arguments. But once you've included those counter arguments, you can then kind of disprove them with your own evidence. So you can say, this is a really good point, and someone might say this. However, here's a really good piece of evidence to dismiss that. So it doesn't have to be completely balanced, but as long as you've considered all different points of view, then that's a really good academic writing style. Can images be included in support for the essay? So you can include images if it's useful. Just remember to reference them in your bibliography. So if you're writing an essay that's to do with one of the questions on classics or architecture and you want to include an image in that, feel free to include it in your essay. It's absolutely fine. You can Google how to reference images and it will show you how to correctly reference where you got it from and who took the photograph or who did the piece of art, and that will make sure you're referencing it correctly. Is there a suggested source list or reading list on the Cambridge Uni website? So there isn't a kind of reading list for this competition. There are loads of different ways you could research for it. There is one source I'd recommend if you're looking for ways to find information. There is a document that Cambridge produces that is called Supercurricular Suggestions. So if you just Google Cambridge Supercurricular Suggestions, it will come up. I'll put that in the chat so you can see it as well. And this document lists lots of different ways that you can find information relating to the different subjects that Cambridge offers. So it isn't specific to any of the essay questions, but it will have recommendations for a lot of the different subjects that the essay questions cover, so where you can find information. So have a look at that if you're struggling to find anything. If you include counter arguments, do you need to disprove them? So you definitely need to show that your argument is more persuasive. So you essentially want to make sure that you're showing that your argument is the best, that yours has the best evidence. And so if you do include counter arguments, just at some point later on in the essay or at the end of that paragraph, you can explain why it's a good argument, but yours is better. Just reading this one. I've had one question about counter arguments. Do you believe that we should include a counter argument in most of the paragraphs and at the end say why your point is more reasonable, or split it into sections such as 3 paragraphs for your point and 2 for counter? I think the latter is possibly a better structure, so perhaps 3 paragraphs for your point and 2 for counter arguments. However, you don't have to be kind of that explicit with it. You can approach the question from lots of different angles and include lots of different points. As long as the reader is clear by the end of the essay what your argument is, but you've also considered other points of view, that's all we're really asking. Are the bibliography and citations included in the word count? Good question. They're not included, so your word count just includes your introduction, your body paragraphs, and your conclusion. You include as many citations and as many sources in your bibliography as you need to, and these aren't included in the word count. You can set your word counter, if you're using Microsoft Word to count the essay, you can set your word count to exclude citations, so hopefully that helps. How much will it enhance the essay to use a wide range of sources? So I think quite a lot. So the more widely read you are, the more information you'll have at your fingertips, the more examples you'll have to draw upon when you're writing your essay, when you're arguing those points. So hopefully you read loads of different things and find loads of information interesting. And so I think it will make the essay a lot better if you can use lots of different sources and draw upon lots of evidence. So as much as you can find, but it's really easy to carry on with research kind of forever and never stop. So when you think you've got enough information and got enough sources to begin writing your essay, then kind of put the research aside and start writing when you can. I've had a request to go back to the slides about conclusions and introductions, so I'll just skip back to that one. There you go. Do we need to write the bibliography separately at the end, or can we do it as footnotes or an endnote? So if you're using footnotes, I'll go through this more in the third webinar in this series when you come to formatting your essay and doing the footnotes. But essentially, if you're using footnotes, then these should come at the end of each page. And so you'll have all your references within the text and your footnotes at the end of the page. And then your bibliography should be separate at the end of the document, where you kind of collect all your footnotes together and write them all in one bibliography. That method is called Chicago referencing. You can also use Harvard referencing, so you can Google what those mean, but I will be covering both of them in the third webinar in this series if you would like to come along to that. If a question is intended for a certain group, for example, a question with law, but you want to approach it from a philosophical perspective, would you mark down for this? No, not at all. You can approach the question however you see fit based on whatever your subject background is. The questions are all intended to cover multiple subjects, and so if you can make a good argument for that question from your subject background, that's absolutely fine, and it will be very creative, so go for it. If we have a source that is quite extensive or has several books to reference from, would we need to read them in totality, or can we find relevant sections from secondhand accounts about these sources? I would say you definitely don't have to read things in totality. You can kind of skim the source, you can read the introduction or conclusion, or the chapter that it is relevant to. I would say try to avoid referencing secondhand accounts about these sources. If you can, try and find the original source. So for instance, if you find in one book that they've said, oh, John Smith said in his book, and it includes a quote, you would ideally want to be able to reference the John Smith book rather than the book that you found it in. So try and find information from original sources if you can. But if you can't find that, then secondhand sources is fine. Are we allowed to mention our participation in the personal statement? Yes, absolutely. Doing an essay competition like this is really good material for your personal statement because it shows that you've gone beyond the curriculum to do something a bit different and that you're willing to put your own time to your academic studies. A really key thing about personal statements is that it's things you've done outside of school mostly that do relate to your academic studies. So an essay competition like this is a great thing to mention. So yeah, please do. I think I've reached the end of the questions, so if anyone's got any more they want to ask, then please feel free. If you have any more questions that you think of after the webinar, then please feel free to email me. I'm happy to answer kind of questions about the competition. I obviously can't give away any advice about writing for each question, but I would recommend that you come along to the next 2 webinars in the series, and so that will have more information about the writing process and also referencing. A final question on referencing I've just got in. If a book has a large amount of great things to reference, should we pick the best ones and avoid having a large concentration from one source? It's absolutely fine to include a lot of references to one source in your essay if you find it useful. Just make sure it's not the only thing you're referencing, and make sure you're getting input from lots of different authors and different people's opinions, so that your essay has covered a lot of literature, and you're drawing your evidence from different places. But having one really useful source is fine, just making sure it's not the only one you're using. So I hope that answers all your questions. As I said, feel free to email with any more, and I will hopefully see you all in the next webinar in the series, which is on the 15th of March. Please do fill out the survey at the end of this Zoom call to provide some feedback on it, and I'll hopefully see you all next time. Thank you very much for coming.